Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our Wolf Humanities series on this year's theme of kinship, which is put together by our topic director this year, who is Professor Ramya Srinivasan, who's sitting here. My name is Karen Redrobe, and I'm the director of Penn's Wolf Humanities Center, and I'm very excited to welcome you here for tonight's lecture by Professor Deboleena Roy, who will be introduced by Ramya shortly. The lecture tonight is co-sponsored by Penn's Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women, and I want to thank them for their collaboration on this event. I also want to let you know that after the talk outside, the Penn Book Center will be here, and they will be selling copies of Professor Roy's book, Molecular Feminisms, Biology, Becomings, and Life in the Lab. So I encourage you to go learn more about this topic through that book afterwards. The Wolf Humanities Center program is generously sponsored by the Wolf Family Foundation, the Hershey Family Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Office of the Dean in the School of Arts and Sciences. Thank you to our fabulous Wolf staff members, they're all amazing, and to everyone who makes the American Sign Language program possible. The interpreters, Dr. Jamie Fisher, the Provost Excellence Through Diversity Fund, the Penn Language Center, and the Dean of Arts and Sciences. During the Q&A that we'll have after the talk, I just want to ask you to raise your hand, please, and wait until the microphone is brought to you as we record all of our events, and we want to make sure that people can hear your questions. We can also take questions in sign language and translate them for the audience. Please do take one of the programs if you don't have them there at the back and share them with someone who you think might like to come to our other lectures. We really like to see new faces in the audience, and all of our program details are also on our website. Our next Wolf event is going to be on Wednesday, November 13th at 7 p.m. in the Lightbox Cinema at International House, when the acclaimed filmmaker Sue Friedrich will be screening her film, I Cannot Tell You How I Feel. And then she and I will be in conversation about the film, which details how Sue Friedrich and her family members dealt with her mother's memory loss and her move into assisted living. And the next Kinship lecture will be on Wednesday, November 20th at 5 p.m., when also at Lightbox, when Professor Erin Moriarty Harrelson, who is an assistant professor of deaf studies at Gallaudet University, will present her lecture in American Sign Language with voice interpretation. Her talk is entitled #Deaf Travel, an ethnography of deaf tourist mobilities, and it will include clips from her film that was made during fieldwork in Bali. This promises to be a really fantastic lecture, and it will be followed by a reception that is open to everyone, so please do come. And now let me hand over the microphone to Professor Srinivasan.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have with us today Deboleena Roy, Chair of the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. She holds a joint faculty position as Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, as well as Neuroscience and Behavioral Biology, and is also faculty in the Neuroscience program in the Graduate Division of Biological and Biomedical Sciences at Emory. She received her PhD in reproductive neuroendocrinology and molecular biology from the Institute of Medical Science at the University of Toronto. She was a visiting scholar at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown University and has held faculty fellowships at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University, as well as the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry at Emory. Professor Roy is interested in developing feminist practices that contribute to scientific inquiry in the lab. Her fields of interest include feminist theory, feminist science and technology studies, neuroscience, molecular biology, postcolonial theory, and reproductive justice movements. She's explored rigorously how knowledge is produced jointly by reproductive justice advocates and molecular biologists. She's published numerous articles, and her book, Molecular Feminisms, Biology, Becomings, and Life in the Lab, which will be on sale outside later, was published in 2018 by the University of Washington Press. I'd like to end by quoting her own first response in that book to her question, should feminists clone? Quote, several years back, I seriously thought about cloning myself, but only twice. I needed 2 duplicates plus an original template, making for a total of 3. The plan was that one clone could teach in a women's studies department, and another clone could raise 2 young children. The third, the original me, the template, could take care of such pleasantries as writing this book. I, the template, would also be responsible for developing feminist science and technology studies practices so that the pleasures and dangers of new and emerging biotechnologies, such as cloning, would not go unexamined in these strange times, unquote. Professor Roy.
So I want to thank Professor Redrobe for this invitation, also to Professor Srinivasan for organizing this fantastic theme around kinship. And I also want to thank the staff of the Wolf Center, Sarah Varney, Sarah Malinsky, and Drew Baker for organizing this and for getting me here and up to this podium, and the podium where I don't get covered, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to go in. I will be doing some reading from here and as well for my book. But this project actually kind of started a long time ago. And it started when I made that decision to actually do a PhD in neuroscience and reproductive biology and molecular biology. It's taken me almost 15, 20 years to bring that world that I was living in into this kind of form. As a scientist, you're not trained to write books. And so it took me a while to get here, but I'm really excited to be able to share this work with you all. So as a feminist neuroscientist and a joint faculty member in the Department of WGSS and NBB at Emory University, interdisciplinary work is my bread and butter. After years of conducting research and teaching courses across the natural sciences and humanities, I know that interdisciplinarity can be thought of in multiple ways. The primary focus of my interdisciplinary work has been motivated by a commitment to understanding and learning to appreciate the intricate practices of disparate disciplines. This may be due to the fact that I began my training as a scientist and began training to become a feminist scientist during a time that is now referred to as the science wars. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the science wars, this was a period of heated debate and somewhat hostile exchanges between scientific realists and post-structuralists that took place in the mid to late 90s. These debates involved discussions around scientific objectivity and the possibilities of societal influences on scientific inquiry, what we might today refer to as unconscious bias. The publication of several books and journal articles during this period led to a series of high-profile disputes, and in some cases, a deep mistrust between academics housed in the sciences and those housed in the humanities. As a graduate student in the neurosciences in Canada, I started my PhD in molecular biology and reproductive neuroendocrinology, just as the science wars were in full swing. I was actually blissfully unaware of one of the most scandalous scholarly disputes that transpired during the science wars, the Sokal affair. And I can talk about this later during the Q&A if you like. But somehow I had already come to the understanding that science and society were co-constituted. I already knew that I wanted to become a feminist scientist who could bring reproductive justice work into conversation with reproductive biology research. I also knew that this world would entail learning the intricate practices of different disciplines and developing an appreciation for different ways of encountering the world. Now, nearly 2 decades after the science wars, we find ourselves in a new era. We find ourselves in a political time and place where all forms of academic research, whether in the physical and natural sciences, the social sciences, or the humanities, are all potentially under threat. Who would have thought back in the 90s, when the science wars were raging, that scientists would have to stand up for science itself? Who would have imagined that scientists would be marching for science? It turns out that the skills that humanities scholars and social justice advocates have had to hone over the last 2 decades, including interdisciplinary institution building, community organization and outreach, and finding creative ways for obtaining funding support are now key skills required for everyone in academia, scientists included. In a curious way, I see this strange moment as also providing us with opportunities for forming new interdisciplinary alliances. A few years ago, I started thinking about putting my interdisciplinary skills into action in novel ways. I decided that I would use my classroom space as a place where students in both the sciences and humanities could come together to learn how to form joint conversations. It's one thing to teach neuroscience students about feminist theory and women's studies students about biology. It's a different project to provide students with the tools to create their own interdisciplinary conversations and collaborations. I realized that over the years, much of my work across the natural sciences and women's studies had prepared me to facilitate such conversations. So my recent book, Molecular Feminisms, Biology, Becomings, and Life in the Lab, is really a project about learning how to make interdisciplinary connections. It is written not so much as a treatise following the science wars, but rather as a guide for building coalitions and for creating horizontal social movements from within the sciences and humanities. The book aims to provide a reflective space for both feminist scientists in the natural sciences who participate in bench research, as well as feminists in the humanities and social sciences who are eager to use scientific research and data to inform their feminist analyses. It also invites scholars of feminist theory, post-colonial studies, philosophy of science, animal studies, post-humanist ethics, and the biological sciences to participate in joint conversations and hopefully create shared vocabularies for interdisciplinary work. This project really began with the scientific research I conducted on the molecular effects and signal transduction mechanisms of melatonin, estrogen, and androgen receptors on an in vitro model of hypothalamic neurons. And these neurons are called gonadotropin-releasing hormone neurons, or GnRH neurons. My work in reproductive neuroendocrinology and molecular biology revealed the presence and mechanisms of feedback regulation by pineal and gonadal hormones at the level of the brain in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG axis. These findings were significant for two reasons. First, they provided evidence against a top-down or hierarchical paradigm commonly used to study the HPG axis in mammals. So typically the way the HPG axis is thought about and how students learn about this field is that it's a top-down kind of hierarchy, that the brain sends signals to the rest of the body and the body does what the brain says to do. So part of my PhD research was actually to see what hormones being secreted by the testes and by ovaries were doing at the level of the brain, so that there was feedback regulation happening. And so we could kind of change the paradigm that it wasn't this hierarchical model. And secondly, the research showed that hormone-based contraceptives and hormone replacement therapies, or HRTs, designed for humans may not only act at the level of ovaries, testes, the uterus, and breast tissue, but also may have broader systemic effects, including neuroendocrine regulation of circadian rhythmicity and reproductive functions. So the way that I showed that it was actually feedback regulation happening was that these neurons, they had never been characterized to see what kind of estrogen or androgen receptors they expressed, because it was thought there was no place for these receptors in these particular neurons. So by asking that question and following that line of inquiry, we were able to show that these cells actually expressed estrogen receptors and androgen receptors. So these receptors, they're all over your body. So if you're using HRTs, that's going to be targeting, all over, not just in one place. So interestingly, though, my decision to pursue this scientific research was in fact driven by my involvement in reproductive justice movements, both at the local and national levels in Canada. The challenge I faced, however, once I was in the sciences, was that in order to get to these important scientific findings, my research required using molecular biology techniques and practices that many feminists also harshly critiqued. These practices, in turn, included the use of bacteria, transgenic animals, in vitro cell lines, and recombinant DNA technologies. it became clear to me that for those of us out there who wanted to become feminists, but also wanted to participate in the creation of new scientific knowledge on the body at the molecular and genetic levels, facing such dilemmas was going to be an important part of the project. Since then, the dilemmas I have encountered in trying to do what feminist STS scholar and historian of science Michelle Murphy calls practice science as feminism have been challenging, but also extremely productive. As a result, my efforts and contributions in the field of feminist STS have focused on creating more sustained dialogues at the intersections of molecular biology, neuroscience, and reproductive justice work. And one of the key dialogues in this work has in fact centered around the question of kinship. So before I go into the rest of my talk, I actually wanted to share one of my recent projects with you. And this is an NSF grant that I received back in 2016. The work for it actually just wrapped up, oh, that's the wrong one. The work for it just wrapped up a few months ago. But it's a project that is really trying to bring together these, or build a shared language and shared vocabulary between neuroscientists, molecular biologists, and reproductive justice advocates. So the project, I should go back here actually. It's called the Co-Production of Knowledge by Reproductive Justice Advocates and Molecular Biologists. And I had put feminist in the title as well, and the NSF, they were very interested in the project, but they actively told me to remove that word because this was around 2016. And I was told that depending on the new administration that comes in, that certain science might be targeted. And so that if I wanted to have my project funded, it would be wise to remove the word feminist from the title. So this is what it became. But the project really was kind of spurred by a decision that was made by the NIH, National Institutes of Health, in 2016, to do sex-balanced research at the preclinical level. So, since the 1990s, there has been a mandate in the NSF to do sex-balanced clinical research, which means that both men and women should be included as test subjects when you're testing drugs or coming up with new medications. So that's not that long ago. That's just, 20 years. But in 2016, they decided, well, so much of our research now is coming at the preclinical stage, right at the level of basic science, in the lab, with cell lines, with animals, so that now that research should be sex-balanced, meaning that if you're going to use cell lines, they should be female-derived cell lines, or you should also have a female animal model. So this is tricky because for the feminists in the room or the women's studies scholars, queer theorists, you will know that just kind of using a binary understanding of sex is very problematic. And in fact, some of this policy just kind of reinvigorates that kind of a binary. But the fact of the matter is that for a lot of scientists, they want to pursue this question because for them, it's at least one difference that they can start analyzing. And for a lot of reproductive justice advocates, yes, they think that women should be included in much of this work. So I did use this policy as kind of a launching pad to start a discussion. Like, what would reproductive justice advocates want to, how do they think about this new policy, as well as molecular neuroendocrinologists? So the project actually was looking at this policy, and I developed a website with the help of other collaborators, looking at the impacts of kind of our world around us on our molecular and neuroendocrine events that happen. So, and maybe folks have heard of epigenetics. So there's a field within epigenetics that is molecular neuroepigenetics. So that is looking at the effects of, our environment, our diet, stress levels, at the level of genes that are expressed in the brain. And interestingly enough, there are molecular neuroendocrinologists who study sex differences, who are also looking at epigenetics. So you see it's multi-layered. So that they're seeing what kind of effects of stress, what kind of effects will stress have on female subjects versus male subjects, and if there's a difference. So I put this kind of question to molecular biologists, and they said, yeah, this is what we need to understand. And then when you ask this question to reproductive justice advocates, they say, well, of course, we know that stress has an impact on our bodies. We didn't need science to tell us this. But science is now catching along. We interviewed quite a few people. This does not represent everyone, but we worked with 2 reproductive justice organizations in Atlanta. The first being Sister Song, which is one of the oldest reproductive justice organizations, and it started in Atlanta, as well as Spark, which is a queer and people of color reproductive justice organization. And I also worked with 2 molecular neuroendocrinology labs. And this website, if you have time and if you're interested, it is that project of trying to create a shared vocabulary. So, for instance, after all the interviews, we decided to look at some of the key terms that were coming up that we could maybe translate between these 2 groups of knowers. And one of them was actually shared language. So if you go onto the site and you click on something like shared language, it'll tell you, why was I looking at this particular key term, what was of interest. And then it will take you to a portion of an interview with a reproductive justice advocate as well as with a neuroscientist who are both trying to talk about developing a shared language. So I just want to take you to Monica Simpson's little quote here from Sister Song.
With capacity, and it has to do with creating more shared language for folks to really understand and to be in communication with each other.
What are your opinions of scientific contributions to reproductive justice to date?
I think I would say that it's a positive approach. I think that there are some folks who come to science from an intersectional perspective, who come with knowledge and of grassroots communities, who come with a desire to want to see those communities survive and thrive, right? So I think that, like yourself, right? There are folks who are in this field who are invested in that, and so I think that those contributions are extremely helpful, right? To moving a policy or helping us, increase access or to help people understand it. I think all of that's great.
For those of you who might not be familiar with reproductive justice work, I wanted to actually just also, the website is full of all these definitions, and it's meant to invite, the non-expert into this conversation as well, so that molecular biologists are trying to understand what reproductive justice advocates are saying and the other way around. So for reproductive justice, it's a contemporary framework for activism and for thinking about the experience of reproduction through an intersectional approach. This approach allows us to think about reproductive health through an analysis that includes social and cultural factors such as race, sex, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and more. It's a political movement that reminds us of the eugenic past associated with the field of genetics and implores us to keep this in mind as we move forward with new scientific inquiry. And so this was an important frame that I would bring to the molecular biologists who were doing this work and say, do you see that there's a link between the history of eugenics in this country and the research that you're doing? So how can you convey what you're doing to a public that needs to know that this is not going to go down that road again? Okay, so this is just one example of the type of research that I'm doing that brings together neuroscience and reproductive justice work. I'm going to now return to this question of kinship and how it has actually functioned in my work. Let me go back to this slideshow. So returning to the book, I developed what I call a biophilosophy of becoming that aims to think about kinship in the lab and address the difficulty that arises when we begin to examine the relationship between a scientist and their so-called object of study. And perhaps due to my entry into the sciences by way of reproductive justice frameworks, interrogating that relationship between the knower and the known has been at the forefront of my research. By turning to questions of ontology, epistemology, and ethics, I connect the feminist scientists' dilemmas in the lab to feminist, post-colonial, and decolonial STS interrogations of scientific knowledge production. I do this by thinking with bacteria, by thinking with the in vitro cell line of hypothalamic neurons that I worked with, and by thinking with the everyday lab techniques involved in molecular biology research. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is about, thinking actually along these lines about kinship with grass. So the book is actually also available through open access, and you can, it's through the Manifold site. It was sponsored by a Mellon grant that Emory received. But what I'm going to do now is read to you from the hardcover version, the introduction of the book. Stolonic strategies. A few years back, a severe rainstorm brought down a mighty oak tree in my neighbor's backyard. The tree fell towards my house, with the top branches just scraping the roof above the bedroom where I slept. I've had several tree encounters in my life, from climbing trees as a child, to planting saplings as a Girl Scout, to walking through the mighty trunk of an ancient redwood in California. This particular tree encounter, however, was the first one that nearly ended my life. Despite the near-death encounter, I would not say that I am over trees or even tired of trees, as Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's statement is often understood. I've been around long enough to know that trees, like humans, have to live and die too. Interestingly, the event that was this tree spurred another very curious event that taught me a great deal. The day the tree fell, I was in shock. This shock turned into immense awe as I watched countless animals and insects scurry in and out of the tree's topmost branches, which were now at my eye level. Had the tree trunk not been in imperceptible relationships with several different species of ants over a 60 to 70-year period, it would not have been hollowed by rot, too weak to withstand the wind gust that brought it down that day. It is not often that one has the opportunity to get up close to the leaves, branches, insects, and other tree becomings that generally transpire 5 to 10 stories above ground. As much as they were opposed to arboreal thought, Deleuze and Guattari were also fully aware of such tree becomings. They stated, "A new rhizome may form in the heart of a tree, the hollow of a root, the crook of a branch, or else it is a microscopic element of the tree root, a radical that gets rhizome production going. Indeed, by way of this fallen tree, I was brought into a new intimate relationship with grass, made keenly aware of the strategies used by grass stolons to grow and remake the world." Removing the massive tree trunk and enormous branches from my backyard took several days. But once these were gone, I realized that practically all of the grass that had been growing where the tree had fallen was also gone. This tree may have deterritorialized when it was cut into hundreds of small pieces and removed from the yard, but the microscopic element of its root tree made its way known through the remaining blades of grass that lay crushed upon my lawn. The easy answer would have been to lay down new sod. For several reasons, one of which was most certainly financial, I didn't want to replace the grass that had been destroyed, at least not immediately. I had a sense that the ground should have some time to recover from the blow. But more important, I did not want to erase the event that was that tree so quickly. By opening myself up to the root of least interference, I witnessed over 3 full years the slow processes of stolonic growth in a species of everyday backyard Bermuda grass. I literally spent time watching grass grow. I witnessed, as Dinesh Kumar and Yashbir Singh Shive explain in their definition of a stolon, how creeping grasses spread not by a rhizomatic root system that is underground and generally invisible to human senses, but rather by the stolonic processes of developing new shoots and extending horizontal stems that grow above ground. Over time, I became captivated with the outwardly stretching veins that run along the surface of the ground, constantly reaching out in search of connections, feeling around. This is how I realized that grass has a strategy that works. This strategy is one of becoming, And as Deleuze and Guattari write, this strategy works at making a communicating world. I use a similar strategy throughout this book to think more carefully about new connections and communications that can emerge between molecular biology and feminism. My hope is to show that by thinking with molecular feminisms, biophilosophies of becoming, and microphysiologies of desire, we can see that biology and biological processes need not be essentializing or deterministic. As a feminist scientist trained in molecular biology and reproductive neuroendocrinology, I often wonder what knowledges we as feminists might have created by now if we weren't constantly having to spend time and energy producing counterclaims to essentializing or deterministic language, paradigms, and experimental designs in the biological sciences. What if we were able to use, as Audre Lorde suggested years ago, our power of the erotic to think about science, biology, and molecular biology? By the term erotic, Lorde was referring to the potential, desires, and creative forces that lie within us to create change. Angie Willey has recently drawn from Lorde's work to introduce the idea of biopossibilities and to encourage us to think differently about bodies and biologies. Can biopossibilities and the playfulness that comes with powers of the erotic change how we approach bodies and matters in the lab? Would feminists be more willing to do biology if we knew from the start that the outcomes of our research would not bind us to an unwelcome fate? What if, after all, anatomy was not our entire destiny, but was indeed involved in the emergent and expressive processes of life forms in all their becomings? What if biological reductionism was not seen as an end to scientific knowledge, but instead as a means to connect more intimately to the multiple microscopic and molecular actants that make up the world within and around us? What if learning how to see the world was also about learning how to encounter the world? By using strategies inspired by Grass, and by extending stolonic runners between new and old feminist engagements with science, I hope we will be able to think anew. What is at stake here is relevant to scholars in both the biological sciences and the humanities. It is the chance to learn how to approach bodies and matter through new lines of flight and to embrace the erotic possibilities and capacities that come with becoming a blade of grass. So that's from the intro of the book. So now I want to, for the remaining time that I have, just concentrate now on one of these ideas that I developed using the strategies that I learned from Grass, and I call it Biophilosophies of Becoming. So becoming a blade of grass is perhaps an odd place to begin the task of developing an interdisciplinary project. Thinking about blades of grass that grow under our feet, or grass that grows on carefully manicured lawns if you happen to live in a concrete jungle, might appear at first to have very little to do with either molecular biology or feminism, let alone theories and practices in and out of the lab. However, the space where these matters all meet has everything to do with how we think about and approach the blade of grass. Those of us who have had intimate access to grass, whether in our backyards, public parks, savannas, or in actual grasslands, may be able to recall the smell of freshly cut grass or the feeling of cool blades under our feet. Perhaps you can remember sitting on a soft bed of grass while watching a faraway sunset. Some of us may even recall pulling out handfuls of grass only to find a shallow mess of tangled roots growing together. Alternatively, the thought of grass may conjure for you less idyllic reflections and instead raise concerns regarding the threat of deforestation, the development of genetically modified grass to provide even green turfs for playing golf, images of overly trimmed and herbicide-treated lawns that have been produced at high environmental costs simply for the benefit of human notions of natural beauty, or perhaps even remind one of old colonial English gardens and ornamental grasses that were planted and pruned outside of England in order to civilize supposedly backward and barbaric lands. Each and every one of these reflections is valid. But what the chapter epigraphs for this section of my book that's called Biophilosophies of Becoming would have us consider, however, is that perhaps our thoughts on grass, whether we are pleased by its presence or not, may not just be about contemplating its role as a silent backdrop to our outdoor excursions, or considering the historical and political factors that go behind our enjoyment of picturesque green vistas. Rather, the epigraphs suggest that the thought of becoming a blade of grass or getting closer to grass is more about acknowledging the desires, voice, and status of grass. They raise the question of how we as humans act toward and respond to something as simple as grass, and ultimately how we might orient ourselves to a more diverse range of matters that constitute our own bodies, our lives, and the world around us. While taking pause to consider our relationship with grass, we may be inclined to start ruminating on our own human status compared to that of grass and our grand place among all of nature's organisms and elements. The organisms and elements of nature referred to here include non-human animals, plant life, microorganisms, molecules, and even those rocks, minerals, and inorganic matters all around us that have been deemed inanimate or non-living. By beginning with a blade of grass, or better yet, with molecules that love and that work toward becoming a blade of grass, with grass that has the capability to scream, or with a blade of grass that holds equal footing with the sunbeams and stars, and I'm quoting from here, we may be prompted to go even further and pose some difficult questions regarding not only the nature of our human encounters with the environment, but also questions regarding the nature of nature itself. We might, for instance, start to consider more seriously the possibility that the world is perceived and actualized not only by humans, but also by non-human beings, organic and inorganic, animate and inanimate, living and non-living. We might begin to pay more attention to and give more credit to the intricate and perhaps even imperceptible forces that push and pull, or desires that are enacted or expressed by non-human organisms, which undoubtedly contribute to the building up and breaking down of our universe. We might begin to consider more carefully the assemblages and entangled subjectivities that are bound to form between those who claim to observe this nature, never innocently, and those objects in nature which are being observed, never passively. We may further start to question the limitations of what has come to constitute the human subject as an autonomous agent in a liberal humanist sense in our societies, who through a series of moral and legal codes has been given the right to either observe or the choice to be observed. We may start to wonder how our need for defining such a unified subject has undoubtedly resulted in the articulation of those who have come to constitute that subject's other, both human and otherwise. Where these questions regarding the nature and status of humans, human others, non-human others, subjects, objects, knowers, and the to-be known lead us is precisely where the disciplines of philosophy and science have always met, and where they have also promptly become entangled. Some may argue that the boundaries between philosophy and science have never been clear. It is precisely at those spaces of unclear boundaries and entanglements between philosophy and science where feminist, post-colonial, and decolonial scholars have dedicated a great deal of their creativity over the past few decades through their analytical, theoretical, organizational, and material contributions. They have long known the high stakes involved in the not-so-simple acts of observing nature and producing knowledge. Many have pointed out that not all knowledge systems are considered equal, and that in some dominant traditions of philosophy and science, not everyone is considered capable of being a knower, even when the knowledge that is produced relates directly to their own lives and experiences. Feminist, postcolonial, and decolonial scholars have pointed out the cost of coming to know the world if this knowledge is sought and obtained only or primarily through the limited scope of modern, or what is often referred to as Western, traditions of philosophical and scientific inquiry. These traditions of philosophy and science, which are generally traced back to the era of the classical Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, and the European Renaissance, are defined by a metaphysics that made very clear distinctions between the inferior ontological status of raw matter compared to the superiority of that entity which had the capability of moving from raw matter to assuming a form. Plato treated the body as a mere vessel for the soul, and this distinction operates in Cartesian dualisms that further separated man from nature and the mind from the body. This transcendent distinction and relationship between form and matter, or the soul and the body, made its way into the Enlightenment. Ultimately, this metaphysical framework of divisions, distinctions, and discontinuity has led us to the many philosophical and scientific approaches that we are taught and that we observe today, particularly in public and private institutions of higher learning. In addition to seeing the world through the lenses of discontinuity, transcendence, and dualisms, these approaches have been further limited, as some philosophers and historians of science have argued, by their epistemic reliance on reductionism and claims of achieving aperspectival objectivity. In turn, the questions and answers derived from the ontological, epistemological, methodological, and ethical frameworks made possible within this dominant metaphysical tradition have been written into our textbooks. These frameworks have provided the language, ideas, and experiments for how we can come to know the world and how we are to orient ourselves toward the multitude of others that inhabit this world. As Claire Colebrook has stated, the way we think, speak, desire, and see the world is itself political. It produces relations, effects, and organizes our bodies. End of quote. If this is indeed the case, that how we see the world is political to the point of organizing our bodies, then something as simple as how we see and think about a blade of grass may matter a great deal to how we see and think about molecular biology, feminism, and where the two meet. So, in the book and in a lot of my projects, I ask, well, what can cells do? What can bacteria do? What can molecules do? In this particular talk, I'm asking, what can grass do? So what can we learn to know if we begin our inquiries by thinking with the blade of grass? It may be of little to no surprise to agrostologists and serious gardener types out there that in a Carl Linnaeus-inspired taxonomical world, grass has been classified as belonging to the kingdom Plantae, the division Anthophyta, the class Monocotyledons, and if we keep going down the taxonomical ladder even further, into approximately 11,369 accepted different species, according to the Kew Royal Botanic Gardens online database that's aptly called GrassBase. Although grass taxonomy and the practices of naming varieties of grass and identifying the properties of what grass is itself a vast and productive field of analysis, my project focuses on a set of questions that can be applied not only to our knowledge of grass, but to feminism and to molecular biology. So the epigraphs that I showed you before, they prompt us to ask, how does an organism such as a blade of grass happen? How does a blade of grass extend or retract itself through time and space? What does grass require in order to change, develop, grow, and perish? How does grass react to being touched? And how does grass express desire? By turning to these abilities of grass, we can begin to think about matter and molecules not only through classificatory or representational terms, but also through the question of what they can do. What can we learn from the abilities of creeping grasses to spread not only by developing new shoots that emerge from nodes on underground stems, such as rhizomes, but in some cases also by developing horizontal stems that grow above the ground or the stolon? Posing this line of questioning is not only possible, but has in fact become eminently relevant to the field of feminist science and technology studies and to a project such as mine. Rather than asking what counts as grass, defining what grass actually is only in terms of chemical properties and physical structures, or using the traditional and dominant philosophical and scientific practices of naming, identifying, and placing various forms of grass into neat categories by pointing out what it lacks compared to other organisms and differentiating it from what it is not, I want to take a molecular approach to asking what matter, molecules, bodies, and organisms such as grass can do and are capable of doing. Just as I'm reading this, I went to the Motor Museum this morning, and the whole, what do? We name things, and then we find out what doesn't fit in that category, right? So that's what that museum is. All museums are like that, in fact. So by taking a molecular approach to biological matter, bodies, and nature, I follow a line of questioning that is generally less explored in both feminist theory and molecular biology. One that pursues ideas of becoming more than being, movement more than stasis, change more than fixity, and intensities more than identities or essences in biology. This pursuit brings forward what might loosely be referred to and what I refer to as biophilosophies of becoming. So I'm just looking at the time that I have left here, and I want to make sure that I get through to the most important section. I think I'll read you the first two. Okay, so in this idea of biophilosophies of becoming that I describe in the book, I talk about three components or three qualities of these kind of biophilosophies. And the first is changefulness and non-human becomings. The second is kinship and hylozoism, and the third is univocity in immanence. And they each kind of correspond to the three quotes that I put up earlier. The first being changefulness and non-human becomings. So Baba Bharati's epigraph at the beginning of the chapter where I talk about biophilosophies of becoming speaks of the journey of a molecule that a molecule must initially make by becoming a blade of grass in order to find its way back to love. Here, what Bharati means by love is in fact the Lord Krishna himself, from whose bosom it is believed the universe was formed, and to whose bosom all matter and forms are longing to return. So Bharati, who lived from 1868 to 1914, was a Hindu missionary who came to the United States to spread Krishna Chaitanya consciousness and Vaishnava theology. The quote is derived from this text, Sri Krishna, the Lord of Love, written at the turn of the 20th century. The intention of the book, written as a Hindu theistic text in English by a colonial subject of British India, was to share a Hindu story of the history of the universe, from its birth to its destruction, to an American audience. So it must be noted that some postmodern critiques of science and rationalism have recently been aligned with Hindutva, a renewed Hindu nationalist movement that pay increased attention to Vedic science to establish Hindu moral superiority. I highlight the work of Bharati here to show that the idea of ontological univocity, which works against any sense of moral superiority, is not unique to the West or to continental philosophy alone. In the introduction to Bharati's text, he explains that the word Krishna in the ancient language of Sanskrit is derived from the root word karsha, which means to draw. Bharati explains, quote, Krishna means that which draws us to itself, and what in the world draws us more powerfully than love. It is the gravitation of the modern scientist. It is the one source and substance of all magnetism, of all attraction. And when that love is absolutely pure, its power to draw is absolute too. End of quote. So it's not my intention to question what we know about gravity through modern science, or simply replace what we have come to know about gravity through the practices of scientific experimentation or the disciplines of math and physics with the term love. I am interested in what Bharati describes as the draw of love, and want to suggest that the attraction, magnetism, and pull towards something that occurs due to any form of longing may also be characterized in terms of desire. Interestingly, it is this draw or desire that, according to this text, produces motion or movement in matter. Bharati explains, quote, all matter is changeful. Matter is nothing but collected forms of change. Its seeming substance embodies but motion of change, so that its inmost attribute is changefulness. End of quote. So due to this quality of changefulness, he notes, nothing that is living in our universe is finite, not even a blade of grass or the tiniest speck of earth. Bharati draws not only from Hindu theology, but also from scientific research and publications by the Indian biophysicist Sir Jagadish Chandra Bose. Around the same time as the publication of Bharati's text in 1904, Bose was conducting experiments on electromagnetic waves, radio waves, and plant behavioral biology. His experiments troubled the distinctions between the living and the non-living, and suggested that the capacity to respond to a stimulus was not only present in humans and animal tissues, but also in plants, metals, and other non-living entities. Drawing on these findings, Bharati extended the definition of what counts as living, and therefore what has the capacity to express desire, changefulness, and movement beyond the human. So while explaining Deleuze's philosophy of becoming, Claire Colebrook suggests that becoming inhuman is to understand that life is the potential to differ. a sentiment that fits nicely with Bharati's claim that all matter is changeful. Becoming inhuman resonates with Bharati's idea that in order to think about the history of the universe and the passing of time in new ways, we can think about the different temporalities and rhythms of grass. What is important here, and what can be thought of as the first set of tendencies that contribute to a project of developing biophilosophies of becoming, is to realize that becomings and the capacity for changefulness should be extended beyond human bodies to other organic organisms, such as animals, plants, and even to inorganic compounds, molecules, and matter itself. So the last section that I'm going to talk about is kinship and hylozoism. So the second quote that I showed you was actually from Barbara McClintock. And that epigraph would also have us consider our orientation towards grass. I'm particularly struck by her sentiment that grass has the capability to scream. McClintock, who lived from 1902 to 1992, was a biologist who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1983. And it was for her discovery of transposons, or jumping genes. She dedicated her life to studying the chromosomes of different species of maize, starting in the 1930s and pioneering the field of cytogenetics. McClintock's biographer, Evelyn Fox Keller, has explained that developing a feeling for the organism was apparently a common refrain that McClintock used while describing her own approach to scientific research. For me, this phrase of McClintock's has served as a refrain in my own efforts to develop feminist practices in the natural sciences that heighten our awareness of ethical engagements with what it is that we wish to know. McClintock's feeling for the organism returns us to the question of developing an ethics of matter. But for now, I want to hone in on 2 points McClintock raises, namely the ideas of kinship and hylozoism. So interestingly, Keller downplays McClintock's claim. So in the biography that Evelyn Fox Keller wrote about Barbara McClintock, it's actually called Feeling for the Organism. Keller downplays McClintock's claim that grass has the capability to scream, describing it as an uncharacteristic lapse into hyperbole. In specific reference to McClintock's statement that she feels sorry for walking on grass, Keller states, quote, "A bit of poetic license, perhaps, but McClintock is not a poet. She is a scientist," end of quote. McClintock was obviously very attentive to the capabilities of non-human actants, and this willingness to describe the capabilities of grass using expressions commonly reserved for humans, such as screaming, should not be dismissed as crude anthropomorphizing. I would argue that McClintock wants us to reorient ourselves in such a way so that we may learn to be with grass and to listen to what grass has to say, sing, and scream, despite our physical, emotional, intellectual differences or presumed distance as a species. She wants us to be aware of the fact that we do harm to grass, but I don't think that this awareness is geared toward preventing us from walking on grass altogether. Rather, it is beckoning us to recognize a sense of kinship or co-becoming. McClintock's sentiment describes not only a sense of kinship between humans and grass, but also a hylozoism that recognizes the capabilities of grass on an equal footing to those of humans. So hylozoism frames non-human forms, as well as matter that has yet to assume a form, as being active or alive in some kind of way. Rather than following the philosophical tradition of hylomorphism, where all matter is viewed as passive or inert until it assumes a pre-given form, through hylozoism, one has to be willing to consider that all matter, even prior to the movement of this matter into any particular form or relation, has a self-sufficiency and the ability to exert some sort of push or pull on the universe. For instance, the scientific discipline of taxonomy, which has named and divided grass into more than 11,000 species, follows in the tradition of hylomorphism, whereby clear distinctions are drawn between the subordinate properties of raw matter compared to those of actualized or pre-given forms. As useful as it is for organizational purposes, taxonomy is ultimately a practice of drawing lines between raw matters and forms. Taxonomy must go even further by separating forms from each other that are deemed as being different in kind. It is a scientific system that has been utilized not only to differentiate humans from their natural world, but to give different elements, organisms, and even some humans a lesser or subordinate status along a supposed great chain of being. This scientific system requires us to deny the capabilities for change that exists in all matter and to rule out the ontological reliance any given entity has upon another. And lastly, I'm struck by McClintock's claim that basically everything is one, which in other terms may be referring to the univocity of being. In my opinion, she's not trying to collapse, flatten, or disregard this difference. In fact, she spent her entire life analyzing the many species of corn and learning the unique cytogenetic intricacies of each. This connection between the qualities of kinship and hylozoism led McClintock to develop a feeling for the kernels of corn that she studied. It is the ontological univocity articulated through these qualities that biophilosophies of becoming can bring forward. I'm going to skip to my last one here. So becoming a blade of grass, therefore, is not about finding this organism's place along a hierarchical ladder or evolutionary tree, or highlighting what properties or abilities grass lacks compared to humans and other organisms. Neither is it about impersonating or mimicking grass. Rather, becoming a blade of grass is a biophilosophy of becoming that involves thinking about the qualities of changefulness and non-human becomings, kinship and hylozoism, as well as univocity and immanence. It is about making connections to organisms and elements such as grass so that we might find new ways to reach out and new ways to respond to the world around us. It is about using strategies, or what I also call microphysiologies of desire, to approach difference in the world, not through lack, but rather through positive and productive senses. Ultimately, it is about breaking our all too comfortable habits and opening up ourselves up to the molecular. Thank you.
It's fascinating. Thank you for introducing me to grass at this level. I forgot what the long word was that you first had on a slide about the category where it goes out.
The stolonic?
Stolonic.
Yes.
That was a new one for me.
Let's see.
But,
we can go back to that.
But I fail to see how you think of that as sort of a metaphor for communication. Basically, it grows out, and then it bumps into another one. Now, do they communicate? Or
Yes, they do. I'm trying to get to the picture here. Let's see. So they do communicate. So the reason that I actually, thought about using grass as a metaphor, but also learning from its material existence, it took me an entire book to write this and to get to this. But in the conclusion, I talk about urban social movements. That's where grass brought me. So that it is a horizontal movement. And so I talk about stolons, which this is a type of strategy that grass uses to extend. You see they throw these runners? And that's how, this is just regular Bermuda grass. So there are different types of grasses. And so crab grasses, there are cespitous grasses and crab grasses, but these kind of grasses, they throw a stolon, and that's how they make a connection with another clonal outgrowth. So those of you who know some of Deleuze's philosophies, he uses the term, he's a French philosopher who uses this term rhizomes a lot to think about questions in this kind of, instead of a hierarchical or transcendent way, he talks about immanence, that things are kind of on the same level. That things can be spread across a plane, and they all exist on this kind of same plane. So he talks about rhizomatic thought rather than arboreal thought, where there's a root and then ideas have to go from that one root and they get to develop. Instead of in a rhizome, things are dispersed. So a stolon is actually the above ground version. And why it actually works for me for thinking about kind of feminist projects is that the stolon, it does both. It does that kind of dispersion, but also once in a while it needs to kind of settle in a clonal aggregation. And for me, this is kind of the politics of a lot of feminist work. That we talk about kind of post-structuralism's influence on a lot of feminist theory, where identities become dispersed or they're not fixed. There's no essence. But then you also have more kind of identity-based organizing and politics that has to happen. And the feminist and post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak, she talked about this term strategic essentialism. Sometimes you need to collect yourself and call yourself something. If it's woman or if it's queer, you have to call yourself something, and that might help to do some organizing. So Stolons do both of these. They have to sometimes meet, and then they throw out a runner and they get to do what they want to do. So, yeah.
Thanks for that fascinating talk. I can't help but throughout your talk, especially about taxonomic thinking and arboreal thinking and dualistic thinking, think about the way in which Western science has classified human beings into races.
Yeah.
And I've often wondered if the very reason why Western biology focuses so much on classification and taxonomy is because it was so useful for racism.
Absolutely.
And continues to be useful for racist projects. And in a very deep and fundamental way, whether we think classifying is so important because it's so important for political reasons. And so, which brings in what you were saying about it's all about politics in the end. So I wondered if you'd say more about how your biophilosophies of becoming regarding as an opposing way of thinking about grass as part of a taxonomy of organisms, where it places in taxonomy of organisms, could be translated into a way of disrupting the classification of human beings. And thinking about human beings as a tree. A lot of racist thinking uses the metaphor of a tree, that the races are different branches of a tree. And I just one more thing. I'm sorry, this is so.
Sorry, you could have actually written this book, I think.
But also,
these are great questions.
The idea that races were created by nature. And so races are just part of this whole taxonomy of nature that exists for grass, but it also exists for human beings. And it's not, that's a way of saying it's not political.
Right.
Nature caused it, whether it's God caused it or Jefferson would have said nature caused it. Now we say, evolution caused it. So I'm really excited about the idea that there's something that could disrupt this very embedded way of thinking biologically about human beings as classified into races.
I share your excitement about that. That's such a great, there were so many great questions in there and comments. I think, straddling these worlds and training to become a scientist was really, I was asked to do the science by reproductive justice advocates. So I was going to take a different route in life. And then my peers, mentors said, we need feminists to actually learn the science and then change the science from within. And so I took that call, and it was a hard road to go down because all of these kind of ideas and paradigms that are locked in these logics of racism and sexism, you see them operating at the level of the lab bench in every practice almost, right? So first of all, figuring out what's the paradigm, what's the root of that paradigm, and then how do you shift it? I had to learn the science in order to be able to think what to do. You bring one of your first comments was so much of science, actually, modern Western science that we are taught here in labs, not just in the West, now around the world that have these high budgets and biotechnology spreading everywhere, they are from a type of science that was built upon racism and sexism. So once again, at the Mutter Museum this morning, the first thing you enter, there's an interactive kind of panel, and you press it, and the question that comes up is, what makes us human? And I'm scrolling down, and all these different images, they're about male skeletons, this and that. But then the first thing that has to do with a female is about uterus, a prolapsed uterus. So science forms itself on an idea of the female as being sex itself, right? And so that the body of the female human is understood only through that sexual difference. Same goes for race. Who was asking the questions and who got to center themselves as the knower and then point to what gets to be the known? The colonizers, right? So much of scientific inquiry itself and how we have come to know our biology, our body, and even think about molecules is rooted in that past. It's rooted in that eugenic past as well, in molecular biology particularly. And this is why the bridging of reproductive justice work, I have been very intentful about the type of molecular biology I've pursued, and that I'm trying to bring into conversation scientists who kind of have a sense of some social justice thing, but that they can now join this project, because it's clear that a lot of reproductive justice advocates want to work with scientists, right? And in this era that we're in now around women's reproductive autonomy, and yeah, there has to be a partnering. You had so many other rich comments. I'm not sure, but oh. Yes, yeah. I almost actually passed out when I saw you walk in. So, I love your work. Fangirling now. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you for your great talk and all these wonderful questions that you've opened up. I have a question about pedagogy in high schools and universities, and there's a lot of conversation at the moment in our university, and I think lots of universities, about the intro courses and the structure of general requirements and how we teach kind of basic aspects of the humanities or the sciences, and it's often at a higher level of education that some of these combined conversations and interdisciplinary conversations. But it seems to me when you introduce this and the way that the kind of fundamental paradigm shift that you introduce by thinking through grass rather than trees, for example, and displacing that hierarchical logic of being with something else, that's a foundational, it's both advanced science and foundational, and advanced philosophy and foundational thinking that becomes the basis for every other way of thinking about science education. And it seems to me there's an implicit logic for rethinking education from the grass up or something, and the way that we imagine what we're doing, and the way that we think about the different sectors of the university and when these interdisciplinary conversations should happen. And I'm wondering if you're involved in those kind of conversations at your university. And I mean, you mentioned the textbook. It seems like chaos would ensue in like such a, some of us would like take great pleasure in that. But maybe most people wouldn't, and I feel like our freshmen would be really, stressed. So how does one begin like integrating this into a larger vision for the university?
So the one thing that I actually want to point out, also a fantastic multi-layered question, is that I would not have arrived at these ideas of like biophilosophies of becoming and changefulness, or that one has to develop a kinship, unless I had studied molecular biology. Unless I had been trained as a molecular biologist and had witnessed, or participated in these phenomena where if you're studying a molecule as a molecular biologist, just naming that molecule is not what your job is about. You have to find out, what does that molecule do? If you do not find out about the signal transduction mechanisms or the pathways that molecule is involved in, you're not a molecular biologist, you're not doing your job. And so this idea of changefulness, that a molecule is in motion, is in movement, that idea, actually, I got that through molecular biology research. And so conveying this idea and translating it to my colleagues in the sciences has actually been really wonderful, because they get it. And so when they say, yes, we name things, that's just to kind of put a marker on it for a moment. But unless you know what that, what the pathway is and what else is happening, it's not a fulfilling research question. So they get that work. Now, talking about integrating that into curriculum. So I feel like I'm very lucky at Emory. Emory has been doing interdisciplinary research for a long time. They had the first interdisciplinary liberal arts PhD program called the ILA, which, it was 50 years old, and it's been closed down in the last 5-6 years. But I think the ILA did this amazing job of really putting kind of interdisciplinarity throughout the kind of university system. So I was hired at Emory because they wanted it was part of the last strategic plan, where they wanted a neuroscience initiative, where they wanted a neuroscientist to be able to speak to the humanities. And getting that has made, the courses that I get to teach, the colleagues that are on board with this already, I don't have to spend my time arguing that these worlds need to come together. I'm charged with making sure that they do. So that's at the university level, I can say, and it's worked itself into the type of GERs we've been able to design. There's now a requirement for, if you're taking science, you have to take these humanities and science mixed classes, so they're getting this. But your question actually also reminds me of how do we get this to students before they enter into the university system, where already so many of these ideas have been solidified. And it makes me remember the young one, my 15-year-old now, but who I was, breastfeeding during the Should You Clone paper. And so he got into grade 6, and they had this course that they take on scientific knowledge production. And he failed it miserably. And I was so proud of him, because he would argue with the teacher that how can you be objective? What do you mean? And because he'd been hearing me talk about this. So he failed that, but we had a parent-teacher meeting, and we're like, okay, he'll get through this, it's fine. But now, this year, he's in grade 11, and he's taking this IB, the International Baccalaureate, and in it, he's been taught about Lynn Margulis, who I also talk about in the book, who passed away a few years ago, but she was a microbiologist who came up with the idea of symbiogenesis, that organisms are not in constantly, fighting. They're not in this antagonistic relationship or that Darwinian model of struggle of the fittest and survival of the fittest. That in fact, bacteria show us that working symbiotically is how life emerged. Right? So he now appreciates science more because he gets to think along this kind of a line. So I think it's making its way, but maybe the next set of projects from this NSF project would be to look at pedagogy. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just had a couple of comments. Thank you for this. One was listening to you, I was reminded, just as an echo of the Heisenberg principle, you cannot specify both the location and the velocity of an atom at any given time. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, 20th century science has been about uncertainty. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that struck me listening to this was it was a lesson in the power of metaphor. And there's a way in which metaphoric thinking is actually helping you suggest kinships, solidarities, and connections and causations that linear thinking would not do. So the comment then that I think is trying to bridge what Karen just said and what you're trying to do is we think of the foundational pedagogy as teaching linear thinking. And maybe what you're doing is saying, okay, now you unlearn it and you start thinking at the metaphorical level, which is always more layered, and which is not a paradox, but is a closer approximation to the empirical reality, or something like that.
Yeah, but I would also, that's fantastic, it's right on. But I will say that linear thinking is also metaphorical. We had to learn that metaphor. And that had to make sense to all of us. We had to get on board with that. So we've actively been taught not to think non-linearly, right? Or we've actively been taught not to question that distinction between what is nature and what the scientist gets to then know as nature and divide themselves, right? And in one of the chapters, I also talk about the materiality of the metaphor. And I turn to a lot of Vicky Kirby's work here, and some of the feminist new materialism that is really doing very interesting work in seeing how our metaphors have actually become the ontology, right? That if you say that DNA is code, that's a metaphor. But now, with synthetic biology, one could type a code and then have an organic synthesized string of DNA produced. So that metaphor has become the ontology, right? But your other comment about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, absolutely. That kind of is a turn within feminist science and technology studies with a lot of work, but particularly Karen Bradd's work, where, Karen has been bringing this idea and brings it through physics. It has not been brought to biology as such. And I think molecular biology really works well with it. And with other kind of process ontology engagements. So that's, a lot of Elizabeth Gross's work, some of Donna Haraway's work, Rosie Berdotti. So they have definitely informed this project. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. So, as a neuroscientist student now, it's very interesting for me, like, to see how, as you said, this new policy is bringing a whole bunch of new data, and it's more. I guess my question is more pragmatic. Like, as a student, I think I'm mesmerized by all this sex difference studies, but at the same time, we are in a place where the majority of the PIs or professors are men. So then how do we deal with this new information to lead the discussion, to embrace the differences, but at the same time, not to use the science as a way to perpetrate this type of unconscious bias and sexism?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I have a lot of kind of feminist colleagues who, some of them are scientists, some of them are interested in science or are sociologists of science, historians of science, who think that the NIH policy around sex differences research is actually not a good thing and is causing will cause a lot of harm and is causing a lot of problems. And they even question, what is a female model, right? What is a female animal model? When in fact it's a model, right? And if you're doing, I don't know if you're doing in vitro work or in vivo work or behavioral, you have to come up with models in order to do all of your studies. So, for example, in reproductive neurophysiology, one has to use a female mouse model, but you have overrectomized the mouse, and then now you're pumping back hormones in so that you can regulate the hormone cyclicity, and then once it's regulated, now you can do your tests. So already we're talking about a model. So they have problems with what would be then deemed a female model. But I think that having PIs who are interested in sex differences research, I think it is a step that we need to take in order to get to the next phase. That's my hope. So I have this piece that I wrote. It's in this journal called Signs. It's a feminist journal. And it's about sex differences research and how can we use actually this momentum from the NIH to talk about sex differences, but get to a place where the N is more than 2. How can we talk about sex differences that speaks to a lot of kind of feminist theory that is about sexual difference and not just about sex differences? How can we get to a place that we can invite difference and think about difference on its own terms rather than in these binaries? And I think that a lot of molecular neuroendocrinologists are actually on that road, because they've already shown, for example, that when you have a female who's XX, the reason they're studying certain genes in the brain, they're actually looking at X inactivation in the brain. Because if you're a female and you have a double X complement, you cannot have proteins being synthesized by both X chromosomes, or else you'll have double complement, double proteins, you will die. So you have to have the inactivation of one of those X chromosomes. And the patterns of inactivation can change through epigenetic encounters. So look at the difference already that these molecular neuroendocrinologists are getting to studying neuroepigenetics, that they understand that what constitutes a female is not just this one thing. You have to have all the chromosome is being informed by the world outside. And depending on your experience, it's going to be a different chromosome. So look at the multiplicity of the sex right there. So I'm trying to work with those scientists who are open to these ideas. There are mostly are not, but because they are also my colleagues, I feel like I can get them to that conversation because they're doing the research, and sometimes they have to hide certain data or ignore certain data so that it fits the paradigm, right? But then you'll have those that are trying to push beyond. I don't know what the answer was to you just now. I feel like I could talk to you a lot. Having a PI that's a male, I will say some of the most kind of interesting feminist scientists I've met are men. So, it depends on the context.